So, good evening and welcome, a warm welcome to all of you here to the library of the IWM. We are live and streaming across the globe, so we have a bigger audience than those of you who gratefully came to listen to this evening's first colloquium of the Europe's Futures Fellowship. This is the 6th group of fellows that we have at IWM. A project that is very generously funded by the ERSTE Stiftung, and thank you to them for that. We have the fellows in residence in September, and they are non-resident for the rest of the academic year when we meet about 4 or 5 times with them at various venues and for various workshops and seminars, part of them in Vienna again. And I'm very honored to introduce Hanna Shelest, our first Europe's Futures Fellow, to be speaking here in September. Some of us met Hanna when we made a trip with the previous group in Odessa. We traveled to Chisinau and Odessa, and Hanna then gave us a very deep dive briefing, and I'm sure she will share some of the findings that she has. But I'll introduce Hanna because she has an impressive bio, and I think it's worth mentioning all the things she is doing. So Hanna is the Security Studies Program Director at the Foreign Policy Council, Ukrainian PRISM, and the Editor-in-Chief at Ukrainian Analytica. She is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis in Washington, better known as CEPA. Previously, she served as a senior researcher at the National Institute for Strategic Studies under the President of Ukraine, Odessa branch, for more than 10 years. In 2014, she was a visiting research fellow at the NATO Defense College in Rome. She was also an advisor of the working group preparing Ukrainian Navy Strategy 2035 and was involved in working groups developing the foreign policy strategy of Ukraine, the Asian strategy of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and Ukraine's NATO public communication strategy. I won't go on further, just to give you a sense of the broad range of issues that Hanna has been tackling over her career. She was, I can say, just last week at Garmisch at the Marshall Center discussing the issues relating to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Maybe she can share some of the views that occurred there, but I will ask Hanna to give us a 10 to 15-minute introduction, then we'll do a series of questions for me, and then I'll open it up to the audience. So, Hanna, a very warm welcome to you.
Thank you, Ivan, and thank you for bringing me to this fellowship and to this wonderful institute. Definitely, the research that I will be doing here during the year will be a little bit more narrow and specific, that we will try to analyze the reaction of the populist and far-right parties to the war in Ukraine. Today, as you can imagine, as we just started in September, you will not get that answers for me, because I became interested why they acted so differently in different countries. So is it any patterns? Because I don't see any patterns, I don't see any logic. And usually, even that I'm from the humanities, not from applied sciences, but I'm very bad when I don't see logic in something. So that's why I became curious and hope that in June we will be able to speak more precise about those political movements, I would say, even not just parties. And today we decided to speak a little bit wider to see the evolution of the perception of in different countries, in different political spectrums regarding the Russian invasion in Ukraine and the future of the war and the possible end of the war. And here, as you could realize from my crazy biography, I'm coming from the security studies. And maybe for centuries that would be easier to speak about security just in terms of number of tanks or drones or any type of the equipment that you have. But I'm coming from constructivists, so I always believed that in security, in military sphere, perceptions means not less than the actual facts, what you have on the ground. And the last 18 months demonstrated that we are perfect case for any textbook, just to go step by step of what had been written previously in the theoretical books about the perceptions, and how perceptions of different influence both the situation on the ground, the foreign support, foreign aid, and the alliances that been made. And here we decided to look at this evolution, and after 18 months we definitely already can speak about the certain evolution. And that is interesting that within those trends that we already can identify, there are some that unfortunately are stable, meaning that the certain perceptions are not changing. They can come and go, or they're just becoming less prioritized, more prioritized. But at the same time, some of them, and we will talk about them, they're absolutely the same. And it is the question from us how to change it, how to influence them. We still don't have the answers. But luckily, there are some groups or some narratives that after 18 months we managed to change. So we definitely starting from the very, very low level. February 2022. Almost nobody believed in Ukraine. Some countries that have been closer to us, or who also been not very big countries, not very powerful, but who had their struggle before, they understood that even if Ukraine doesn't have enough resources, it would fight because there is no other chances. And we're speaking about the Baltics, first of all, about Polish. But at the same time, that was quite a general perception that was very beneficial for the Russian Federation, that Russia is stronger, Ukraine is very weak, and that this war will happen only 3 days, so who cares, why should we help you? Maximum the help was okay for the humanitarian aid, for those thousands of refugees moving, and definitely a little bit of tears from the pictures of the first bombs falling in the cities that they walked before, from those who've been as a tourist. That was this emotional but extremely depressive perception. And because of these extremely depressive perception of the first days, that been based on the, and we will now try to understand on what it was based, but there was a big mental map, a huge mental map of all those pieces that created this puzzle of this disbelief in Ukraine, that and misunderstanding of Ukraine and how Ukrainians will act, that definitely led us to the political decisions in the security sphere, when, for example, our ambassador to Germany heard from one of the German ministers. Now it is already an open story, we didn't know about it from the very beginning, but one of the ministers just said, why should I send you any help? In 3 days, let's be honest, Kyiv will be Russian. Germany, NATO partner, as we hope, strong supporter, that was the response. The response that was, and this person you couldn't name pro-Russian. So in this case, that's why I didn't start it with these pro-Russian, anti-Russian sentiments, because the main problem, and that is one of those things that remained the same during all 18 years, that didn't change, that even those who named themselves pro-Russians, or better say pro-Ukrainians, very often they were pushing the pro-Russian narratives. And with them, usually, that is much more difficult for communication, for building your strategy, how to act, how to explain, because these type of the people, they can be experts, they can be intellectuals, they can be politicians, they're coming with the idea, we are totally with you, keep strong, but... And after these but, you listen the whole bulk of the Russian narratives about how weak is Ukraine and there is no sense to fight. Probably because of this, in the very first weeks of Russian invasion, one of the most popular phrases among us security experts were that we are not afraid of the war, we are afraid that our partners will make to surrender us. That will be such a push to surrender because of the fears and disbeliefs among our partners, that they will be pressing the Ukrainian government to go not just for the compromises or concessions, but openly to surrender. And unfortunately, we had a lot of insights that led us not just to believe in these, but really having the facts that a lot of diplomats and politicians of European countries were sending these signals to the Ukrainian government. So on what all these positions were based in the beginning of the war. And that is very important because these basics or fundamentals on words the future perception being made, that's something that Ukraine needed to fight, even or to struggle all these months. So first of all, that is very simple things. Individual contacts, especially friendly contacts of a lot of politicians and experts. I had a friend, Masha, in Moscow, who baked a cake for me in 1985 or in 2000, and she's personally so anti-war, so the Russian people cannot support. When you explain that it is one Masha against 140 million population, that doesn't work. This personal attachment to some of the Russian colleagues, but that is probably was also the biggest shock and to some of the politicians or experts later when they found out that, for example, the director of Carnegie Moscow and Carnegie's American center always considered as very liberal, pro-Western. These Dr. Trenin, he's now writing the papers proposing to use nuclear weapons against Ukraine, to deport 2 million Ukrainians, so to influence our perception and cultural attitudes and everything. So, but I remember the first weeks of the war when my Dutch and German colleagues who used to invite Trenin to all of the events after 2014 were speaking, but that is so bad that Carnegie Moscow is closed now, and Trenin was the only voice we could hear. He was the person who understood the situation. 1 year after, this man is with the completely Putin, I would say Nazi even agenda, because deporting 2 million Ukrainians, you would not name it even nationalistic agenda. The second was experience of 1990s. And that is the fundamental that we still cannot overcome. A lot of the diplomats, a lot of the politicians who had experience in negotiations with Russia of 1990s and beginning of 2000s, they still believe that Russia can be good, that because they managed to negotiate with Yeltsin certain things and Yeltsin was ready for the democratic changes in Russia, that means that Putin or his people should do the same. So they still perceive Russia in the paradigm of relations of 1990s, of how they negotiated NATO-Russia Founding Act and everything. So they don't understand that Russia changed. That Russia doesn't want to be part of that Europe, that in most of the Russian text, strategic text, I mean from military doctrine to foreign policy doctrine to national security strategy to the statements of all their political leadership, for the last 10 years they were stating that they are not Europe, they don't want to be Europe, Europe is something hostile, they are Eurasia, they have their third way, as Surkov wrote in his articles, and but they still remember that when Russia wanted to apply to NATO, so probably we need to find out how to return Russia back, and in this conversation of Russia first, Russia should be back to Europe, Ukraine is disappearing. I even had a conversation recently in quite a big dispute with one of the ex-US ambassadors to NATO, saying that, do you know that with such arguments, de facto you're putting states to the first class and second class? Because you're speaking about Russian interests and returning Russia as something primary important, but the interest of Ukraine is something of the second class, like that we can think of the further. The third thing is the cultural Russophile moods. That is extremely difficult because that was the problem in many countries where Russia managed to put this ideal picture of the great opera and ballet dancing and everything. But at the same time, very often, what Sasha was talking just 2 days ago here perfectly, how they covered with their placards in museums the Ukrainian culture. So de facto, when you really start speaking with these people, when they speak about the great Russia culture, you give the name and saying that is Ukraine. And I said, no, that is Russia. In museum it was said that is Russia. I said, yeah, but this person even never worked in Russia. It was Russian Empire, but the person was born in Ukraine, considered himself or herself as Ukrainian. And even if you analyze the picture, for example, of something, there are so many Ukrainian elements, but they were more in European movements. But Russia managed to press this narrative about the great Russia culture, where Ukrainian culture is maximum peasant culture of some folk songs. And when you come to London, for example, or to New York, that is, or Paris, that is where you really feel it within the cultural community, because of that's how they were taught, that's how they grown up. And that is not only with the cultural, that is also with a lot of the diplomatic servants. As Ambassador Herbst, the former US ambassador to Ukraine, said, when I was taught at the university, the history of Ukraine was taught to me through the Russian prism. So only when I became ambassador of US to Ukraine, I learned so many stuff that now I see the post-Soviet space in the absolutely different. But that's why, he also said, for me it was very difficult. My Russophilism, if you can make the English word like this, came from all those studies, from learning of history, of literature, of everything. And that's why for them, it's very difficult to separate their love to the Russian writers or poets to the love of the country sometimes, or their politics. The next point is domestic agenda. And in many countries, we need to understand that domestic agenda definitely influenced and still influencing. And domestic agenda is one of those things that made these also up and downs, the same as from what we started, because when it is elections, we immediately have downgrade. When the certain political parties are coming to power, we see these downgrade. For example, currently we have this trend in Slovakia. Previously, we had these in France during the presidential election. We have it currently in the US elections. We definitely have it in Hungary. With their domestic agenda. And here it is very important to understand what is this domestic agenda and how it influences. Then it is anti-American sentiments. And here we also need to be very clear that sometimes Ukraine is becoming victim of the internal anti-American sentiments within the country. That is the case with Turkey. Turkey is not anti-Ukrainian, but within the certain political forces, when they are very anti-American, that is becoming also in the lack of support of Ukraine and becoming more pro-Russia, because you are either pro-American or pro-Russia. These political parties usually don't see the middle ground in this debate. And the same we can find almost in each European country, because we can find always the forces with the anti-American sentiments over there, and it can be far right, far left, doesn't matter. And the last but not the least is Russian propaganda. And here we should be very much aware that Russian propaganda been working very hardly, not just from 2014, but much earlier. We know perfectly how many Russian resources we had in media, from Russia Today to websites specially created in the languages, the bulk websites as we call them. They've been buying media in different countries, that is the spreading through the social networks, like everything what you talked about, the information warfare, and for many years we had a project learning, like screening the Russian narratives in at least 15 European countries, and I would say that they were absolutely the same. The question is sometimes just to identify which had the more influence, which had less influence. Lithuania was the only country that managed to have the immunity, the total strong immunity against the Russian propaganda. So where we are coming now to over here, that there are four main narratives that became unchangeable. The narrative number one, it is that Russia is stronger than Ukraine, that's why Russia will win. And that's why Ukraine should not fight back. Very often, this explanation is absolutely illogical, when you demonstrate that this war is asymmetrical, that how stronger or less stronger Russia is depends on the sanctions you implement, on the weapons you provide to Ukraine. But this general perception of the second mighty armed forces, which never been true, but that's what really filled inside of those who decide about support Ukraine. The second is nuclear. Nuclear is the monster in the room. Even for the nuclear countries like France, when they speak about escalation, they're afraid of the use of the nuclear weapons. When we try to put the counter arguments that you understand that I usually call nuclear weapons Putin Viagra, because that's something that makes him to feel strong and powerful, and he understands that everybody is afraid of this. So for him to threaten by use of the nuclear weapons is much more important, because if he finally decides to use nuclear weapons, it means he lost all conventional means of the warfare. And that can be only the last result of everything, but because nuclear weapons never been used after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, nobody can really make the personal attachment, like what can it be? We understand what does mean earthquake. We understand what does mean use of these weapons. So when a lot of Ukrainians are making parallels, like, but okay, Putin used already all types of the weapons. Do you think that destruction of Mariupol of the less scope that what one small tactical nuclear weapon can do? There is still the word nuclear that is covering everything. And with this, it is definitely this word escalation. We cannot help you more because it will be escalation. Russia has the red lines. Our questions usually are, okay, what are the red lines? It was Crimea. Just this night, perfect fire. A few days ago, yet one wonderful fire. 2-3 days ago, minus submarine, minus our ship. Do you see any escalation from this, or something what has not been used? Russia is escalating when they have these missiles and drones in their possession, but not when they just think that the certain cross line. Attacks against Moscow, red line. How many we already had? 9, if I'm not mistaken. Yep, they're continuing. And many, many of others. NATO enlargement. Finland, Sweden, welcome to the club. Finland with the bigger border than Ukraine. Nothing changed. Russia even withdrew forces from the border with Finland. So no de-escalation after this. But that is still the narrative that we are fighting. And the last but not the least is definitely we can't help you forever. So even that you hear the phrases, we will help you as soon as you need, oh no, as soon as it takes. Yeah, I like this English word. We will help you as soon as it takes. More and more of my colleagues are saying, what about changing this phrase? Let's help Ukraine as soon as it wins. That is a little bit different, because in this case, you're speaking not about some eternal process without any final destination, but you understand that you're supporting the actions, not to survive, but to win. And definitely, you are providing a little bit different type of support. Not that will just help you to hide in the bomb shelter, but also definitely to liberate the territories with people that are waiting. And it seems to me that the resistance movement at the occupied territories, what we saw last week during the illegal elections at this territory, clearly demonstrated the will of people to be liberated, including Crimea. And that is the last point on which I will go in the introduction, our biggest problem being Crimea. From 2014 till 2022, 99% of our counterparts were saying, yeah, probably Donetsk, Lugansk, you need to return back, but Crimea, are you sure Crimea would like to be back? You know, now after 9 years, that is so difficult. When you spoke to French and Germans, you usually reminded them about Alsace and Lotharingia. That was a good argument for some others as well, but in general, that was the perception. After 2022, that was a certain period of time when we also had idea, yeah, but are you sure you will be able to take Crimea back with the military, or that will be just a separate topic for the conversations? Since autumn last year, at least we managed, in most of the cases, to overcome this fear, and we had more and more evidences to prove that it started in Crimea, it should finish in Crimea. We are not speaking that it should be bombs or something. The task is to get rid of Russians from this territory, but not to destroy towns or something there. But at least we managed to change the discourse that Crimea would like to be back as well, and that Ukraine has a right to return Crimea back in the same way as Donetsk, Luhansk, or definitely Kherson and Zaporizhia regions that have been newly occupied by the Russian Federations. That's why, as for now, we see that some of the narratives and perceptions that formulate the views towards Ukrainian events and the war of Russia in Ukraine with an absolutely different political spectrum. And here I would like to say that I cannot say who is the most problematic for us, far right, far left, centrist, or which country. Partially, if you would really push me, I would say that far left currently are the most problematic, because they still perceive Moscow with that anti-Western, anti-American sentiments, with a little bit of flair of Soviet past of Russia, and thinking that Russia is not empire, but some anti-imperialistic figure. Far right became a crazy cocktail of the different views, and here you have from very pro-Russian like Marine Le Pen, but even she changed her position during the elections, to Italian Meloni, who became an extremely strong supporter after visiting Bucha and Irpin. And centrists, unfortunately, they are very often unstable. And that's also the question still for us, why and what from their perceptions or principles or values do not allow them to make a clear choice when we speak about the future support for Ukraine.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Hanna. That was quite the tour de force, a very complex picture, which I think we've all been witnessing, not only since 2014, but also in particular since 2022. These various perceptions, images, both internationally and domestically, and I'm sure many of the people in the room have had conversations exactly along the lines that you have here drawn for us. Before I open the floor, let me just ask you one or two things. One of the challenges that we all have, of course, Ukraine first and foremost, of those of us who are supporting full-heartedly Ukraine in its struggle to liberate itself fully from the Russian invader, is the approach of what we call, for better or for worse, the Global South. There have been efforts. We know that your Minister Kuleba traveled to Africa and to various places. And some of us, including myself, have heard from people who are our friends in Africa, for example, that these countries privately are expressing uncomfort because of the situation and are not comfortable in supporting either and are seeking for arguments. So could you say something about, given all that you've been involved in and in the strategies that you've been creating, what has Ukraine and its partners, what they have done to help maybe influence the views of these countries in the Global South?
Thank you, Ivan, for this question. That's really quite an interesting one, because we can divide the answer to the diplomatic part and the perception part again. So if we speak about purely diplomatic political part, we should be honest that Ukraine lost Global South because of the absence of the diplomatic representation there. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, de facto Russia took all the Soviet embassies, and Ukraine didn't have capacity and experts to open the same amount. In many of the countries, countries, we had very small embassies or didn't have them alone, and we didn't have the same amount of money to work with these countries compared to the Russian Federation, where they've been very active because they were continuing, they were fighting against the Americans. So as a result, in many of these countries, Russians managed just through the diplomatic perceptions, through the different activities, to be present when we were not. When you're not present, you cannot work properly with these countries. And only now, when we developed, for example, African strategy a year ago, and the president announced the opening of the 10 new embassies, we hope that we will be able to run, but we're running against the clock in this way, because we already lost those 30 years. In terms of the perceptions, the situation is more complicated because partially, we need to understand that in many countries, especially when we speak about Latin America, we are speaking about those far-left political spectrum that is very anti-American, and because the US is helping Ukraine, definitely they couldn't be together with us. They think that it is Russian war against imperialism, and because Moscow had very strong relations supporting these countries. We know these countries. The same they managed to sell in some of the Asian countries. With Africa, the situation is more about Soviet legacy of this anti-imperialistic, that Russia is somebody that supports you. And when we are coming to the African countries and saying that Russia is empire, and it is Ukraine who is fighting anti-imperialistic moods, they still don't accept it because they still, or better, they don't believe it. For them, Russia is that Soviet communist part. And even more difficult when you're coming to them with the idea that Ukraine is the ex-colony and de facto we are fighting our anti-colonial war. Once I received response from the African experts, don't say like this, you are white, you cannot be a colony. And I realized that racism can work opposite way as well. I said like, but okay, let's look, what does it mean to be a colony? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like we had all of this. Why color should matter? But this perception that colonies can be only something not from Europe is so strong in their mentality, in their view towards the world, that it's very difficult to get out. From Ukrainian partners, what they are doing or not, that's, you know, what is interesting, that a lot of partners would like to help. But we appeared in the situation now, because in Ukrainian Prism we have this global partnership project, that very often it is better to come without partners there. Yes, Americans, Brits are ready to support, to finance trips and activities, to share their contacts, but when we are coming through them, it's immediately like, either you are puppets of Americans or all these anti-American sentiments or something, or even you don't respect us. Why you cannot just come and talk with us? Why you need Americans to bring you? And that's what we luckily noticed very, very early. And at least in my organization, we said, thank you for your help. We will be glad for financing because we don't have financing for trips, but no contacts. Give us emails. We will write emails by ourselves. We don't need introduction because we want them to feel respect that it is us who would like to speak with these countries.
And secondly, about the perceptions, and you rightly, of course, said the fact that we are 18 months into this war. And you have talked about the ups and downs in the support or lack thereof to Ukraine in every way, military, humanitarian, and others. Where do you think we are at this point in time? Do you think that there's a stalwart support to continue supporting Ukraine in every regard, or are you, from some of the main actors, feeling that there is a change of heart, maybe behind closed doors and not publicly, saying, well, you know, there are, of course, the reports that Ukraine is suffering huge human losses in the battlefield. Of course, the Russians are as well. How long can you hold out? You know, do you have the human power to go forth? Where do you feel you and we are now in this support to Ukraine, full-hearted support to Ukraine?
It seems to me that we're in flux. We're in quite an unstable situation, and that is very dangerous moment when we can relax, we as a nation or experts, politicians, and thinking that, okay, everybody already understood what is this war about, and we just need to work practically about the support, but support is guaranteed. It's just about will we have this amount of ammunition or this amount of ammunition. But the situation is demonstrating that that is not true. And de facto, we need each month to prove that the support is needed again and again. And there are two reasons for this. Reason number one, it is the constant change of the political situation inside of our partner countries. And those situations where we are becoming just trapped by their domestic issues. We see it now in the several countries where elections started to be. If the different political forces are coming to power, we cannot guarantee that support from these countries would continue. Sometimes for some of the political leaders, it became personal. That's good that, for example, with the change of power in the United Kingdom, we didn't have this change because that was more stable understanding, or better to say, almost unanimous understanding among the political spectrum. But if you go to the US, yes, we have bipartisan support, but we definitely know what the Trump people are talking about. Then you go to Slovakia, to Bulgaria, to these countries, and you understand that elections can change a lot in terms of support. But except of these, that's also definitely the very strong Russian propaganda and active work with the governments of many countries where they try to persuade them in different ways how they're stronger and all those narratives we talked about. And the last but not the least, I cannot say the tiredness of the war. It's normal. It's happening. I mean, it's not normal. You cannot be tired from war, but that's what we saw in all conflicts around the world. That's always happening. You're in the media, then you're disappearing. Somebody has the fatigue, wherever. It's happening everywhere. The issue is that for those who are not involved, it's not that personal, and you started to hear more and more like, but maybe you should be ready for the painful concessions. And we're asking, like, why? But it's already 18 months. So? But your people are dying. Maybe you should just stop it. And then when you're trying to explain what is happening at the occupied territories, or the phrases that I really liked, are you sure you need these additional square kilometers? You're so big. Are you sure you need these places like Mariupol or Bakhmut? It's already destroyed. Do you really need? Do you have money to invest there? And for us now, it is extremely sovereignty and territorial integrity, because this word territorial integrity, we became victims of it because it's the word territorial there. And everybody thinks that we are returning back that village, that territory. And they don't understand that we are returning those people who are not allowed to be Ukrainians living at their land, but just being under occupation. The first things Russians are destroying at the occupied territories, they've been burning Ukrainian books in the libraries. Publicly, like in the Bradbury stories. And that was extremely important. The first movement they were doing, they bringing Russian textbooks to the schools and Russian books to the libraries. That was a special campaigns in all newly occupied towns. So when you're speaking about returning back the territories, you're speaking first of all about returning back those people who don't want to be. That doesn't matter, and that is very important thing. When we're saying Ukrainian, it doesn't mean ethnic Ukrainian. Because at the occupied territories, especially when you go to those territories, you have plenty of ethnic groups that are in the same conditions.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll open it up to the floor now, and please raise your hand and do introduce yourselves. I'll start with Karolina Vejvoda over there. Wait for the microphone, please. But I saw you first, Karolina. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. This has been wonderful. By the way, Karolina Vejvoda. I also have the honor to be Europe's Futures Fellows this year together with Hanna. So I have been listening to Hanna, and I have been imagining the process that you have been depicting, the process that I would name after Michel Foucault as producing the new truth. So the process, the very fast process of producing the new truth about this war, starting from this is not a war at all, and Ukraine is a corrupt and perhaps wild country that would not defend itself, to this is an unjust war, this is our war, I'm talking about the Western narration basically, and we have to take part in it. But then I have been thinking also about just and unjust peace. So we usually think about just and unjust wars, but peace has been not only in the history of Ukraine, but actually in the history of Eastern Europe, over and over again, the argument to impose an unjust order. You know, a year ago, when the full-scale war in Ukraine started, I heard such a sentence said in public among educated and important people. Yalta might have sent you Poles, I'm Polish, to communism for 50 years, but it gave us peace for half a century. So there is something also about just and unjust peace, and I would like you to elaborate a little more about that, because Ukraine is also being pushed to surrender in order to save peace, to regain peace. But this would be unjust peace, wouldn't it?
You're absolutely right. You know, I really like the play of the words that Burrell used in Singapore at the Shangri-La conference in the beginning of June. Shangri-La conference, that is the biggest defense forum in Asia happening each year. He's been speaking to 600 participants, and he said, Ukraine doesn't need just peace. Ukraine needs a just peace. So you understand that that is it's just the accent here, the focus, but that is the sense. And he's been speaking about the tribunal, he's been speaking about the reparation, he's been speaking about return of all territories and everything, and he's been speaking about the war crimes for sure. And I assume that your answer as Polish was that you would definitely prefer not to be with those years under the Soviet power, yeah, let's say in this way, and a lot of those things that happened in Poland. But in our case, the difference is also extremely high, that they asked us, de facto, with this unjust peace, to stop being a nation. Because the requests, like Soviets, never said that Polish should not exist or that Polish is not a nation. They've been more talking about the political and economic development of the country and their interests there. But unfortunately, with the Russian Federation, even that the original statements was about the enlargement of NATO, what was definitely just a cover because Ukraine was neutral in 2014, it didn't prevent intervention. But most of the Putin statements are clearly genocidal intention, with all the ideas that Ukrainians should not exist. All this re-educating of Ukrainian kids, re-education of Ukrainian population. I'm quoting top-level politicians. I'm quoting the president of the country. So that's why there is definitely this thin line of what does mean justice. And in Ukrainian case, surely the ideal situation when we want everything, reparations, tribunal, war crimes, everything, but the concessions that I can envisage that, for example, maybe not all money will be paid to Ukraine for the compensation of what's been done in the country. Yep. But at the same time, I cannot imagine that Ukraine in the current stage will say, no tribunal for Bucha. Because that will be unjust, not for Ukraine, that will be unjust for the universal values, and here I'm saying not European values, but universal values of human rights.
Okay, Jan?
Jan Farfel, Jerzy Giedroyć Visiting Fellow. Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. And perhaps going back to your original point about the perceptions, I mean, one of the aspects about the perception is that the last 18 months showed that actually perceptions can be very fragile, because otherwise, if we kept believing those stories, we wouldn't be talking about the continued Ukrainian resistance. But when we think about perceptions, they fall under this category of disinformation campaigns, which can be seen in the broader process of the hybrid warfare itself. So, well, shortly before invasion, the full-scale invasion in 2022, Galeotti wrote a book about weaponization of everything, saying that we won't see any full-scale kinetic wars. So, asking about this general perspective, what kind of lessons can you see when we think about hybrid warfare, and how did the last 18 months influence our perception of hybrid warfare?
Thank you. First of all, we definitely need to put very clearly the term hybrid warfare, because it is hybrid as it has both military and non-military component. It's not just information warfare. And here a lot of the Russian hybrid warfare worked, especially in the information sphere, because it was supported by the certain military threats. I would not say military actions, but military threats. But also because very often they supported it with the cyber attacks, with the energy pressure, with the work with proxies in the countries, through the political movements and all contacts, and even through the bribery. We know plenty of cases within the Council of Europe, within the our European Parliament, within the local politicians who've been just bribed to promote the Russian agenda. And here I would say that the methods used are quite interesting, because they've been used both against Ukraine and against our partners. And here I would say that some of our partners became even bigger victims than Ukraine, because we were more aware of these actions after 2014 and at least tried to cope with some of them, and other countries been very relaxed. This country been extremely relaxed about this type of the influence, till the moment when you need to expel that amount of spies from the embassy, for example. Yeah. So don't tell me that nobody knew. It was just the relaxing mood that nothing happened. Because of this, with the propaganda, it became much more sophisticated. The open, blatant propaganda work in 2014, that's where we saw it. But after closing of many of the Russian sources, media, expelling some of their representatives, it's become more difficult for Russians to spread open propaganda. So they started to work more through the proxies, when the Russian narratives are pressed by the locals. So they always can say, and that was the case in Ukraine in the beginning of the war, but I'm Ukrainian patriot. So, and then you have the person who is now perfectly living in Moscow, but providing the all Russian narratives, but saying that I'm the biggest Ukrainian patriot, that's why I act like this, and this. And, or we need to remember that Russians very seldom are inventing propaganda or inventing the narrative. Very often they are finding the weak issue inside of the country and using it. And you can find plenty of examples. If you have problems with ethnic minorities, that's exactly what they will try to push. If you have problem in the energy sphere, they immediately try to push it. If you have any doubt, specific moods because of the Second World War, like that's happened in Germany, because Germany had this sentiment that they cannot fight against Russia again, that they cannot provide weapons that will be used against Russia again, and it been perfectly manipulated and exaggerated inside of our German political elite through the media, and then definitely we saw it for months and months in the German decision-making, till they made a first big step of giving what is necessary and change in the Scholz position. Still not full, but he's improving. So that's why this propaganda influenced a lot, but it became more sophisticated, and we need to understand that the methods are changing, not channels only. Will you use Facebook or Twitter, yeah, but also the way of presenting these ideas.
Okay, over there.
My name is Massimo. I'm working for the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights. I have two questions. One is, in the next month, the EU member states will possibly make one step further towards the Ukrainian accession to the European Union. What does that mean for Ukrainian people? And the second question is, a few months ago, in March, the International Criminal Court made an important decision incriminating Putin, and in the next days, the Human Rights Council might elect Russia to be part of the Human Rights Council. May I have your opinion on the incoherence of the international organizations regarding the same topic? Thanks.
First of all, about the European Union integration, I think that the latest public polls, they clearly demonstrate that more than 80% of Ukrainian population supports the European Union and NATO integration of the country. And most of the Ukrainians clearly understanding that it's not only the choice of our foreign policy, it's not only with whom we would like to be, but that is also the values and reforms that we would like to happen in Ukraine. And even 2014, that was more about values and emotions. So by 2022, it is already a clear understanding that the process of European integration is not less important for the country than the final result of the integration. Because that is all those reforms that, first of all, Ukraine needs. And we would like to be at that level of. That's why we understand that it will be all these moods, but they are in many European countries. Should Brussels dictate to you and so on? And I mean, we are absolutely in the same discourse in this case when it is coming to the European Union. But at least as for now, the readiness of the civil society to push the European integration is very high. And luckily, we see the almost unanimous position among the members of parliament. Some of them just not always understand the correlation between some of their decision and European integration. For this, we need the accountability and control from the civil society or experts level, but it's going. And it seems to me that as for now, it's already unstoppable. When you speak about the Human Rights Council, first of all, I mean, you should remember that last year Ukraine was excluded. Russia was excluded by Ukrainian actions. More than 100 countries voted for this in the UN General Assembly. So it is very minimal chances that Russia will do anything like this. They are trying now to be in the all UN committees, all UN like everywhere where it's possible in the boards, but all those cases that I know our diplomats managed not to allow this to happen. They're working very hardly to build all possible coalitions not to allow Russia to be elected. Still, we had Iran in the Human Rights Council, for years, so that anything can be possible. My hope is that because we saw those voting for the UN General Assembly resolutions when you had more than 140 countries supporting Ukraine, something we couldn't imagine 2 years ago, that's also already not only our position, but we have quite a coalition of those who understands the unacceptability. And don't forget that criminal courts opened this week their office in Ukraine. So more and more information will be coming, not just from Ukrainian prosecutor office, but directly from them, and it will give more evidences to our partners, to those countries that cannot be on the ground, to formulate their position and to understand why it is important.
There was a question back there. Yep.
Yes, thank you, Seri Kudeli at Baylor University. Thank you, Hanna, for your very insightful presentation. You mentioned several narratives, 4 narratives used to justify additional pressure on Ukraine to start negotiating with Russia. Let me add another one, and that is the narrative of stalemate. So over the last several months, very influential foreign policy figures in Washington on the pages of the Foreign Affairs, published a series of articles where they basically argued that no matter what the West does, there will always be a parity on the battlefield. There is no wonder weapon that will help Ukraine to break through the defensive lines of Russia. And Russians can always outmobilize the Ukrainians just because there are just more men in Russia. As a result, these realists, and most of them belong to the realist camp, argue that at some point there will be a contact line, a battle line that we would have to agree on, that it will be stable, static, and around this battle line or contact line we would have to negotiate a new agreement, whether it will be a ceasefire, a permanent ceasefire, or temporary ceasefire, but that should be an agreement on this. What is your response to this argument about the eventuality of the stalemate?
Thank you, Sergey. I can have security answer, security expert answer, and I can have the folk answer. I hope I will be excused for the phrase, but that is very traditional Ukrainian saying. If to translate it roughly, it will be, I will better sheet up than obey. That is the very, very classical Ukrainian old saying, and de facto it means that to obey for something, that Ukrainians are so stubborn that if somebody is saying that you cannot do it or you should do something like this, usually doesn't have the result of that person that is trying to press really would like to get. That's why as soon as Ukrainians are said on the battlefield you cannot do it, the soldiers say, like, maybe not today, but if you give me a little bit of this, this, and this, let's find a solution. And we definitely see it on the ground. From the security point of view, unfortunately, we all perceive the contact line purely from what is published in the morning newspapers, yep. And they see a picture, and they see suddenly a small village. Oh, what does it mean? It's just a small village. Not understanding that, first of all, Ukrainian territory is so huge that taking this small village, de facto, you took 20 square kilometers that can be bigger than some of the European towns. But also the question is that sometimes this very, very small village can be extremely important from the logistics point of view. And also that Ukraine is not, it is not a Second World War, First World War, when you're just going line by line and you need to have these flanks and everything. You need to see to the whole picture of what is happening. And we definitely cannot say that we are currently at the stalemate moment, because Ukrainian tactic is differently. We are pushing the line, and now is the most difficult, this first line of defense that is heavily mined territories. You cannot move there quickly. It is just technically impossible. But then you have daily attacks. And where you have these daily attacks? It is behind the third line of defense, because you're attacking exactly the storage of ammunition, the Russian air defense system, their airfields, so everything that is supporting Russian defense. So de facto, you're leaving Russians also naked just with the first line, and probably at your daily news, you still have the line covering the same and following the same villages, but it is not the same situation what is from the military perspective, because Russians already don't have with what to support. Plus, we all the time are speaking about the asymmetrical war, and that is usually our answer. Ukraine almost lost our navy. First, we lost 75% of Navy in Crimea in 2014, and then it is less in the news, but several Ukrainian ships been heavily damaged during these 18 months. So we don't have a big ship to go into fight like in the 16th or 17th century in the middle of the Black Sea, but marine drones, Sea Baby worked very well. So why no? And Sea Baby is the name of one of the drones, for those who don't know. And that was a play of the words, because the head of the security services who initiated that operation with Sea Baby, his last name, if to translate it into English, means baby. So that was the year, that the baby you see baby to fight against the Russian fleet. So few of sea babies, and Russia is without the big ship. So that's the asymmetrical war in which we is. That's why just to calculate who has more people is becoming irrelevant, but that is becoming very interesting. And that is, by the way, but one of the factors that I forgot to say in the beginning, the evolution, what we really noticed that military people in most of our partners believing much more in Ukraine than politicians. Because military understand this development on the ground much better. They follow the tactics, the strategy. They are extremely curious in what is happening. And that's why it was easier for us all to speak with American senators or House representatives who had the military background, because they were immediately interested in what is happening. They immediately caught what is happening on the ground. And I remember the story a few weeks ago, a very famous Ukrainian pilot died, quite a young guy, Jews. And he was brought to US last July because he was one of those advocating for F-16 for Ukraine. And the meeting was organized with the representative Adam Kinzinger. And he's the former pilot. So when these two officers were brought to his room, he's currently just a politician, and they wanted to speak how to make, to speed up the training of the Ukrainian pilots. That was the advocacy. And he said, like, guys, I know, I support you completely. Do you have 1 hour? I really would like to speak with you. Tell me about that battles over Kiev. And they said, without all those who accompany them, without embassy people, they've been just talking about the real stuff that have been interesting. He became so much inspired because of all the stories. He really realized what is the level of Ukrainian pilots. And then he made tremendous job how to push a certain change of the US legislations. So to make possible both F-16 and training of Ukrainian pilots. But he is ex-military. And the same is happening with many of the generals, ex-generals who are currently helping Ukraine in advocacy compared to others who never, and many of those politicians even never been in the army, so they couldn't understand it.
So if I can briefly summarize, a frozen conflict is a no.
You know, the frozen conflict is a no, and I was talking about this even before February 2022, but that is probably coming from my background in conflict studies. I've been in many of these conflict zones. I thought that the frozen conflict is the worst case scenario for Ukraine. The reason is we have Transnistria as one of the wonderful examples just at our border. 30 years of frozen conflict, what you have? Sides can have talks about talks where they meet the next time, who will be the part of the delegation. They're talking about these for years. Does it change anything on the ground? No. Nagorno-Karabakh, for how many decades it been a frozen conflict? We are now, like in 2020 we had the war, and now we're on the edge of the new war. So frozen conflict, even that it is seen as the immediate solution, as the ceasefire, but we need to understand that the ceasefire and frozen conflict are two different things. And we should not, because any of the frozen conflict is becoming protracted conflict. And that's what we would like to exclude from our agenda.
Very good. There was another question. Yes, please. Microphone is coming.
Thank you. Thank you. Sasha Dovzhak, IWM Documenting Ukraine Fellow. Thank you, Hanna, for your insights and your expertise. I wanted to tie my question to the name of the program, Europe's Futures, and to cite the brother of our colleague, Olesya Hromychuk, who said that this was a European war which happened to start in eastern Ukraine. This person was killed on the front line in 2017. He is no longer fighting. He was a soldier. He volunteered to defend his country. I just want to bring this problem home to Europe and to hear if you agree with his message that it was a European war which happened to start in eastern Ukraine. And if we can actually say that Europe's futures are being decided on the battlefields in Ukraine? Thank you.
You know, in many ways, I would absolutely agree with this, both from the strategic point of view and from the cultural point of view. And here, let's just look to the several things. Even if many European countries and many European politicians are emphasizing each time we don't want to enter the war, like we are trying to escape it as much as possible, but Russia perceived them as part of the war, as the party to the conflict. In most of the Russian statements, you hear that they are fighting the West, they are fighting not just Ukraine. And that looks quite like illogical or even very dangerous, because when one side clearly names another one as the enemy, and this side is escaping, it looks like, you know, when your 2-year-old child is hiding, saying, I don't see you, so you don't see me. So that's what a lot of European politicians have been doing, like, we are not in war with you, so you cannot be in war with us. No, for Russian politicians and Russian military, they are in war with Germans, with Polish, with the Americans, with Canadians, and adding to the narratives, usually when Russians are losing, remember the Kharkiv stories, half of them were that they lost because of the crazy Polish soldiers. So, Polish soldiers, it is the worst monster on the battlefield, according to the Russian military chats. There should be either black soldier, without any country, so it's just the image of that, and Polish. I don't know how they identified that it is exactly Polish, and there were no Polish soldiers, yeah, but that became these military myths or fairy tales of Russian social networks. So that's why it's already, I already would say, plus when you started to provide weapons in this amount, when you started to invent sanctions and everything, you already cannot say that you're not part of this conflict. You are not physically fighting, but you already took the side. You are already in the certain coalition. So that's why it's absolutely, from the strategic point of view, I would say that it is European war. But then from the cultural, or how you would name this sphere, Ukraine is fighting for the European values, to be able to be with these European values of human rights. Even that, you know, I don't like the phrase European values, because de facto we're speaking about the universal values. And this phrase European values became part of the Russian propaganda as well, because it is traditional values against European values. So traditional values is something without gender rights, for example, or without LGBT rights. But European values, it is all those pervasive Europeans and what you're doing. That's why Ukraine is probably the only country that now has this experience to defend with arms for what we've all been fighting in our philosophical books, in our political discourse on the battlefield for centuries. And it's just that because in so many countries, the perception was that these values is something as axioma, they are untouchable, that it is still difficult to understand that this fight is for being what they are, to be that Europe that's been created out of all the tragedies of the 19th and 20th century.
I saw back there Ilir, and then afterwards, yeah.
Thank you very much. Hi, I'm Ilir Deda from Kosovo, and just a quick reflection on what you have been saying. I think in Southeast Europe, people would say as well that we have never seen the West mobilize so quickly to support, as they have provided support for Ukraine. There is a complete support in our continent, and let alone and United States and in other continents as well, for your just defense and your just war. And if the West would have mobilized so quickly when the dissolution of Yugoslavia began, we wouldn't have had 10 years of wars in the former Yugoslav area. So I understand from personal experience, like many points of your, it looks like frustration, but at the same time, you have not been alone in the last 18 months, and if we somehow, I mean, peace will come, peace comes. But what the war in Ukraine has also reshaped Europe and European Union, because you have achieved the unthinkable. You will be members of European Union. And in comparison to Western Balkans, for example, right now, you are more part of the EU single market than we are, although we have been in the accession process far longer than you. So there is a different perspective, right, that I think has to be taken into account, because we haven't seen in the last 30 years the West doing as much as they have been doing now for you. Thank you.
Thank you. You know, I'm smiling because I would a little bit disagree. That's definitely about the perception. First of all, I just started remembering the Balkans wars, let's say like this, yep, not just dissolution. And remember how quickly Germany came to Croatia, for example. That was very quick. Yep, to Slovenia. That was very quick. I mean, that was like immediately. The problem was probably that everything been much more complicated first. The second, at that time, European Union didn't feel itself as the security actor yet. So both conditions, conditions were different a little bit. That's first. The second is that I cannot say that we received the help quickly. It took just 9 years. The war didn't start on the 24th of February 2022 when I woke up from the explosion in Odessa. The war started on the 20th February 2014 when the Russian forces came to Crimea and when Crimea was illegally annexed. What actions been done? The first action NATO did at that time, it was to prohibit Russian ambassador to come unaccompanied to the headquarters. That was considered as the huge achievement of the immediate actions. Then we didn't have anything till May, probably, when the full military action started in Donbass. But Crimea was just almost excused for Russians. If you look to the sanctions for the annexation of Crimea, they are ridiculous. They are more individual about no visa or frozen account for the lover of some politician. That's why I would say that the support came because of the many countries built this understanding for 9 years. And with the EU integration, Ukrainian problem was politics, not economics. Our association agreement, we understand perfectly what type of the market we are. So I would not compare the inclusion in the single market because of the war or security necessities. We're speaking about the absolutely different economic potential and interest, and there are plenty of researchers now that European Union gained from the association agreement before the war, much more than what Ukraine gained in terms of the access to the European markets because of the conditions and everything. So that's why this sphere is much more pragmatic. However, yes, given candidate status, I would say here I would agree with you that this push last year was predominantly driven by the choice of, foreign policy choice. But still, will negotiations be open? Let's see. We still have 2 weeks, or something like this before the decision should be made, and it's not going that smooth as we probably are dreaming. And you see what is happening with NATO. Balkans have much better chances in terms of NATO than Ukraine. Nobody's doubting that you should be there compared to us. So it all comparable.
So are you saying that, are you skeptical about Ukraine and Moldova getting in December at the EU Council a date to begin accession talks? You think it's still an open question? From where I sit far away, I can't see the EU not giving you a date because it's symbolically so huge, but in real terms, of course, it doesn't cost Europe anything to give a date.
You know, that is really, I mean, first of all, we still need to adapt to certain legislation. So it is also up to Ukraine that we can give a reason for skeptics, like, for example, Hungary to block the process. So we still have these risk moments that I will not. That is like a difficult football match. You should be ready not till the minute 90, but to minute 90 plus 3. So we are now at minute 89, and unfortunately, you cannot be sure. But at the same time, you're absolutely right. Just saying that we are opening negotiations, but then really opening the chapters for negotiations, it is different.
Okay. There was a question somewhere in the middle here.
Mm-hmm.
If not, then we go.
We were talking about war fatigue across the world earlier. How is it? How do the Ukrainians feel? Is there war fatigue? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, surely. I'm just trying to think how I feel, because I stay all these months in Ukraine, so I've been not the immigrant, except for the traveling like this. How do you feel when you wake up almost each night because of the air raid and siren sounds? You have a country of 40 million people with the certain post-traumatic syndrome. Yesterday, we've been at Misha and the thunderstorm started. What Ukrainians did, you immediately could identify Ukrainians in the room. The first thunderstorm, it was immediate reaction, what is wrong? It's physical, it's something that you cannot. So this type of the stress and physical fatigue, that was definitely the whole country is experiencing. Do you have a moral fatigue because of the difficulties and because of the war? Partially, yes. That's why you see the new waves of those people who are moving abroad, for example, when our electric system been bombed heavily last autumn. But at the same time, you see a lot of people who are returning back. And one of the reasons, because it is the clear understanding that it is existential war. We didn't have our existential war in 1991. The independence, we received independence too smoothly compared to some other post-Soviet space. And that's what we didn't fight properly in 1918. So the fact that now we are fighting all those wars that we didn't finish previously with Russia. And that's why it is more and more understanding that we cannot stop, or we are stopping to exist. It doesn't mean that 100% of population are acting like this. Otherwise, you would not have collaborators. Otherwise, you would not have traitors. Otherwise, you would not have those with the crazy corruption schemes. I mean, we are absolutely aware of all this. But the general mood is of this internal resilience to what is happening. How long will it take? I don't know. Luckily, I've never been, like, I've been in many conflict zones abroad, but then it is interesting that who supports us more. We recently read it from our friend Syrian, for example. They are supporting Ukraine much more and understanding much more what is happening, and they don't have fatigue or they don't have complaints why Ukraine is helped more compared to somebody sitting in Switzerland or other countries that even don't feel the differences of what is happening. So that's why this fatigue, it is again coming from the perceptions, and when you're in the middle of war, you just understand that you don't have time to be tired.
Okay, question there.
I would build on the question by our representative from Kosovo. And don't you think that the fact of the war in Ukraine and the new impetus in the European Union for enlargement is helping actually the accession of Western Balkan countries thanks to Ukraine?
I would say it's not only Western Balkans. Originally, we were laughing in Ukraine how many countries used the opportunity or this window, yep. But then, I mean, these jokes stopped to be, and we said, like, but that is the right foreign policy of these countries. The best example is Moldova. Moldova jumped immediately when we started to speak about candidacy, about the supports and everything. And I know some of the Ukrainian experts who were extremely critical, like Moldovans, why you're using this opportunity, like why you're using this moment, it is dishonest, why you... But we were sitting like, you also know the Minister of Foreign Affairs, it is our old colleague, and I said like, but Niku is doing exactly what he must do as the Minister of Foreign Affairs. He understood that it is their moment for his country. He's traveling huge, his president is pushing domestic reforms, and if not now, what, like that would be their biggest mistake if they would not use this moment. So in this case, I would say that is the clear difference between Moldovans, for example, and Georgians that just wasted the opportunity that they could have within this. That's why when Bosnia pushed even more with the accessions, I was extremely happy for them, because they said that with all their difficulties that exist inside, including because of the Russian actions, that is the very moment to push agenda, both inside of the country and outside in conversations with Europe. And luckily we see the result, because we know that the candidate status should be given at the next session as well. So that's why, I mean, let's be very cynical. That's the right choice for them. If they can do it, they receive their domestic prices for this.
I would agree with that, Hanna. If no one has any more questions, I will slowly draw this to a close with a comment that some of you have heard me say, that Ukraine is truly fighting for universal values. To put it very, very simply, nobody likes an invader in their living room, and people will fight back to liberate that living room, liberate their country, and I can fully appreciate that from my personal experience from Yugoslavia. After the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, the full invasion of Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact forces, minus Romania, Romania didn't partake in that, I was serving my military service then in Yugoslavia, and we were, in fact, defending ourselves from a potential Soviet Warsaw Pact attack. And we were ready to do what you are doing now. So I can't understand the lack of understanding from certain countries who would say, well, you know, just give up, raise your hands, and, you know, take peace and do this. No, this does not happen. And you have proved, if I can put it that way, a return to heroism, a concept that is ancient, that some people may feel is not valid anymore in a Europe that partially had peace for 50 years. You know, when West Europeans say, well, there's been peace on this continent, well, there hasn't, because Russia invaded Hungary, it invaded Czechoslovakia, Turkey invaded Cyprus, not to go on and on. So it has been a partial peace. And in fact, you are doing what one does in history when we take the longue durée, as the French historian said, you are defending your freedom, and that is very basic. So thank you, Hanna, very much, and looking forward to your colleagues in the next colloquia. So let's join me in thanking Hanna for her presentation.
Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Okay, and wine and cheese, of course. I'm sorry not to.
Yep. For those who, for the first time here, one floor down, we're waiting you for the wine.